200 years ago, America ran on wood and animal muscle. Today in 2025, it just set a record 107 quadrillion British thermal units of energy produced in a single year, the fourth consecutive annual record. More energy than any country on Earth has ever pumped, mined, refined, and exported in a single calendar year. But here is the part that most people completely miss. The United States did not get there because of brilliant government planning, strategic vision, or some grand national energy policy. It got there because of a bankrupt railroad conductor in Pennsylvania, a stubborn son of a Greek immigrant goat herder in Texas, and a whole lot of catastrophic failures that accidentally turned into the greatest energy story in human history. This is 200 years of America's energy history, and I promise you by the end you will understand why the thing that almost destroyed this country is now the thing that makes it the most powerful energy nation on Earth. Let me start where every good American story starts, not with the founding fathers, not with a president, with fire. Wood, a renewable energy source, served as the preeminent form of energy in the United States until the mid to late 1800s. Think about what that actually means for a second. For the first 100 years of this republic, the primary energy strategy of the most ambitious nation in the history of civilization was find a tree, cut it down, burn it. Domesticated animals such as horses and oxen were used for transport, and water wheels along with wood combustion were used for cooking and heating. If you were alive in 1820 and you wanted to heat your home, cook your food, power your factory, or move your boat, the answer was almost always the same. You burned something organic, you burned a lot of it, and you hoped there was more where that came from. From wood-burning stoves to coal-fired factories to the gas and oil of the automobile age. The history of energy in the United States is marked by many shifts, but understanding those shifts, really understanding them, requires you to know something most people never learn in school. Energy transitions in America were never clean, never planned, and never smooth. Every single one of them was messy, accidental, and fought over bitterly by the people who had everything to lose from the old system. And every single time, the people who believed the old fuel was permanent were proven catastrophically wrong. Here is the first pattern interrupt I want you to hold on to, because it will show up again and again. The people who were most certain about where energy was heading were consistently the most wrong, and the people everyone called crazy, Drake Mitchell and a dozen others you have never heard of, were consistently the ones who changed everything. Now 1825, the coal age is beginning, but nobody quite knows it yet. In the early 1800s, some of the first commercial coal mines were operating in several parts of the country. Coal provided more heat per pound than wood and occupied a smaller volume. It was a much more portable fuel. In Pennsylvania, miners began extracting a higher carbon form of coal known as anthracite on an industrial scale. It rapidly became a common source of residential heating in Philadelphia and other northeastern cities. And by the 1840s, anthracite became the standard form of coal used throughout the eastern seaboard. But coal needed something to unlock its full potential. It needed railroads. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the relationship between coal and railroads in the 19th century was one of the most circular, self-reinforcing economic feedback loops in American history. Railroads needed coal to run their steam engines. Coal mines needed railroads to move their product to market. Each industry made the other richer. After 1870, rail lines extended south and east from Pittsburgh to rich bituminous coal fields, such as the one centered around Connellsville, one of the nation's richest supplies of coke and coal, an important fuel source for the iron and steel industry. Northern railroads and factories took the lead in replacing wood and water power with coal. By the 1860s, booming northern coal mines, the Union produced 38 times more coal than the Confederacy, and the war industries they fueled helped to give the Union a decisive material advantage. Let that sink in for a second. The Union won the Civil War in part because it had more coal. Energy was not just an economic story, it was always a geopolitical one. Steadily, coal consumption climbed, and in the late 1800s, the amount of energy produced from coal exceeded the amount produced from wood. Industrialization, the use of coal to power machinery, and the use of coal in electric power generation supported a strong demand for coal. Things got a lot more interesting around 1885 when coal surpassed wood and fueled an exponential jump in consumption. America was not burning a little more coal, it was burning orders of magnitude more coal. Steel mills, blast furnaces, locomotive boilers, steamships, the first electric power plants, all of it ran on coal. The country's energy consumption was not growing linearly, it was growing exponentially, and nobody, not a single industrialist, politician, or economist saw what was coming next. Stay with me because this next part changes everything. August 27th, 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania. A man named Edwin Drake has been drilling a hole in the ground for a year and a half and has nothing to show for it. The Union won the Civil War in part because it had more coal. Energy was not just an economic story, it was always a geopolitical one. Steadily, coal consumption climbed, and in the late 1800s, the amount of energy produced from coal exceeded the amount produced from wood. Industrialization, the use of coal to power machinery, and the use of coal in electric power generation supported a strong demand. Things got a lot more interesting around 1885 when coal surpassed wood and fueled an exponential jump in consumption. America was not burning a little more coal. It was burning orders of magnitude more coal. Steel mills, blast furnaces, locomotive boilers, steamships, the first electric power plants, all of it ran on coal. The country's energy consumption was not growing linearly. It was growing exponentially. And nobody, not a single industrialist, politician, or economist saw what was coming next. Stay with me, because this next part changes everything. August 27th, 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania. A man named Edwin Drake has been drilling a hole in the ground for a year and a half and has nothing to show for it. Colonel Drake faced difficulties from the beginning. The known methods of drilling for oil at the time only ended in failure. He spent 5 months trying to recover oil, and people had lost their trust in him, and some began calling him Crazy Drake. His investors had given up. Edwin Drake's quest to find oil by drilling had consumed all his resources, and investors in the first oil company wanted him out. A letter was literally on its way to him at that moment, telling him to stop, to pack it up, to come home. Fortunately, that letter was not delivered until after they found oil. On August 27th, 1859, the Drake well struck oil at 69.5 feet, giving birth to an industry that has forever shaped our modern world. 69 feet. He did not even go deep. He was not even close to the 1,000 feet he had planned to reach. He struck black gold less than 7 stories underground on a day when he was essentially out of money and out of time. He had been publicly humiliated for months by people who thought he was delusional. Pennsylvania's oil production went from around 2,000 barrels in 1859 to approximately 500,000 barrels by 1865. That is a growth rate of 25,000% in 6 years. The scenery of Titusville changed almost overnight. By the late 19th century, the U.S. was producing over 80% of the world's oil supply. Yep, you heard that right. 80%. The United States produced 80% of the entire world's oil in the late 1800s. A country that had barely figured out how to drill a well in 1859 became the planet's oil superpower within a single generation. And where there is oil, there is someone trying to control all of it. Enter John the 500, back Rockefeller, the most hated man in America and by some estimates the richest person in modern history, founded by John the 500. Rockefeller in 1870, Standard Oil grew through aggressive horizontal and vertical integration. By the early 1900s, the company controlled approximately 90% of the oil refined in the United States. 90%. Rockefeller did not just dominate the oil industry, he essentially was the oil industry. His dominance was achieved through controversial tactics, including predatory pricing and secret rebates with railroads, which stifled any meaningful competition. Now here is the pattern interrupt that most people skip over, and it is genuinely fascinating. By 1874, Rockefeller's share of the petroleum market jumped to 25%, and by 1880, it skyrocketed to about 85%. Meanwhile, the price of oil plummeted from 30 cents per gallon in 1869 to 8 cents in 1885. So yes, Rockefeller was a monopolist, but he was also making oil dramatically cheaper for ordinary Americans. The man was simultaneously the villain of the story, and depending on how you look at it, the engine of American economic growth. The investigation that ultimately brought him down was written by journalist Ida Minerva Tarbell, the daughter of an independent refiner ruined by Rockefeller. She published a 19-part investigation in McClure's magazine that exposed every backroom deal, every railroad kickback, every competitor Rockefeller had quietly strangled. On May 15, 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil, the oil empire built by John the 500th Rockefeller. The Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust be dissolved under the Sherman Antitrust Act and split into 34 companies. The shale revolution began in 1901 when George Mitchell finally cracked the code. Hydraulic fracking unlocked the Barnett Shale. For nearly 2 decades, Mitchell refined the technique. His own engineers told him he was wasting his money. He didn't listen. Finally, in the 1990s, it worked. The wells produced far more gas than ever before. Costs dropped. The impossible became profitable. This is the single most important moment in American energy history since Drake struck oil in Titusville, and almost nobody talks about it. As advances in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling unlocked shale gas and oil around 2006, domestic production surged by more than 30% between 2005 and 2012. 3 decades of decline reversed by one man who refused to listen to his own engineers. U.S. shale gas production went from 5 billion cubic feet per day in 2007 to 80 billion in 2023, a 16-fold increase in 16 years. That is a compounded annual growth rate of 20.8% per year. If your savings account grew like that, you'd retire in 15 minutes. The United States was transformed from a country running out of natural gas in 2007, building import terminals, to the world's largest producer in 2011. By 2018, the U.S. overtook Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest producer of crude oil. Since 2017, it has held the top spot. The The country, humiliated by an oil embargo in 1973, dependent on foreign oil for decades, is now the largest oil producer in the world, and it got there not through government intervention, but because one Greek-American wildcatter from Galveston refused to accept that something was impossible. George Mitchell died in July 2013 at age 94. He got to watch the revolution he started reshape the entire global energy market. In 2019, the United States became a net exporter of energy for the first time since 1952. Not just oil, but all forms of energy. Energy exports grew to a record 30.9 quadrillion British thermal units in 2024. Imports stayed flat, the highest net exports in records dating back to 1949. The country that couldn't buy gasoline on Sundays in 1973 is now exporting more energy than any nation has ever exported in recorded history. But wait, we're not at the end yet. Because while the shale revolution rewrote the fossil fuel story, something else was happening simultaneously. In 2019, U.S. annual energy consumption from renewable sources exceeded coal consumption for the first time since before 1885. The last time America consumed more renewable energy than coal was before the age of electricity, before the automobile, before the telephone. In 2024, U.S. solar production grew by 25%, wind by 8%. Both set records. Renewable energy production and consumption reached all-time highs in 2025. Renewables now account for about 9% of total primary energy production. That sounds small, but every major energy source started at 0%. Wood to coal took over 50 years. Coal to oil took another 50. Oil to natural gas took decades more. Infrastructure is the hidden variable. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 directed nearly $400 billion toward clean energy. In 2 years, it drove over $115 billion in investments. The United States in 2025 is doing something historically unprecedented. It is the world's largest fossil fuel producer and a leader in renewable energy investment. These two things reflect a genuine tension, the wealth from fossil fuels versus the long-term imperative of transitioning away from them. Energy consumption totaled 94.2 quads in 2024, below the 2007 peak of 99.0 quads. The economy is larger, but we're using energy more efficiently. Petroleum remains the largest source at 35.3 quads. Natural gas hit an all-time high at 34.2 quads. Coal fell to its lowest level in recorded history, 7.9 quads. Oil is still king. Natural gas is at an all-time high. Renewables are growing at 20 to 25% per year, all simultaneously. History loves a pattern interrupt. And the barrier is always the physical infrastructure. The pipelines, the refineries, the power lines. It has to be built or rebuilt before a new fuel can reach the people who need it. Coal found its first major use in home heating in the 1850s, but it took over 50 years to fully displace wood in homes. By contrast, in the 1940s and 50s, households dropped coal for oil and gas heaters rapidly because the pipeline network was already in place. That one sentence explains why some transitions take 50 years and others take 5. The country that lays the infrastructure for the next fuel first wins. Right now, in the mid-2020s, an enormous infrastructure build-out for solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles is underway simultaneously with record production of oil, gas, and natural gas plant liquids. Both things are true at once. The country is transitioning and not transitioning at the same time, which is historically exactly how every major energy transition has looked from the inside. Nuclear electricity generation has increased as a result of 2 new large reactors that went into operation in 2023 and 2024. After decades of stagnation following 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, nuclear power is quietly being reconsidered as a low-carbon baseload energy source that can complement the intermittency of solar and wind. The United States is the second largest energy consumer in the world, behind China. Per capita consumption is around 6.5 tons of oil equivalent per capita, more than 70% higher than the OECD average. Americans use more energy per person than almost anyone else on Earth. That is partly geography, partly culture, partly economics, but it also means that when the United States shifts how it generates and uses energy, the effect on global markets, global emissions, and global geopolitics is enormous. American energy decisions ripple outward to the entire planet. Here is the last pattern interrupt I want to leave you with before we land this story. The energy crisis of 1973, the one that scarred an entire generation of American policymakers and created the modern obsession with energy independence, was ultimately resolved not by diplomacy, not by conservation, not by renewable energy, and not by government strategy. It was resolved by one man in Texas who refused to believe that shale gas was inaccessible, who spent 2 decades being told he was wasting his money, and who died at 94 having changed the entire world. That man's name appears in almost no history textbooks. His company, Mitchell Energy and Development, is not a household name. Over his career, he participated in drilling some 10,000 wells, including more than 1,000 wildcats, wells drilled away from known fields. His company was credited with more than 200 oil and 350 natural gas discoveries, and yet if you ask most Americans who solve the problem of U.S. energy dependence, they will name a politician or a policy or a piece of legislation rather than the wildcatter from Galveston who simply refused to accept the word impossible. The full arc of 200 200 years of American energy history is at its deepest level a story about individual stubbornness and collective infrastructure, about the gap between what exists and what could exist, about the extraordinary human capacity to be wrong about what is permanent and right about what is possible. Edwin Drake was called crazy for drilling a hole in Pennsylvania. He changed the world. George Mitchell was told for 2 decades he was wasting his money. He changed the world again. And somewhere right now there is probably someone working on something in energy storage, or next generation nuclear, or some technology that does not yet have a name, who is being told exactly the same thing. You are wasting your time. This cannot scale. The economics do not work. What stands out from the 200-year history of global energy use is that energy transitions have been very slow in the past. It has taken many decades, or even a century, for a particular energy source to become dominant. But slow, in the context of history, is different from impossible. And impossible, as Drake and Mitchell both demonstrated, usually just means nobody has been stubborn enough yet. The shale revolution began in 1981 when George Mitchell successfully used hydraulic fracturing to complete a vertical natural gas well drilled into the Barnett Shale to a depth of 7,856 feet. Hydraulic fracking is exactly what it sounds like. You pump high-pressure fluid down into the rock, the pressure cracks the rock open. The gas and oil trapped inside flows out. Mitchell kept refining the technique for nearly 2 decades. His firm spent nearly 2 decades developing hydraulic fracturing, finally finding success in North Texas's Barnett Shale formation in the 1990s. Finally, after decades of effort, it worked. The wells began producing far more gas than ever before, and the cost dropped low enough to make shale gas drilling not just feasible but profitable. The energy industry took notice. What had once been considered an impossible dream became a full-scale energy revolution. This is the single most important moment in American energy history since Drake struck oil in Titusville, and almost nobody talks about it. As advances in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling started unlocking oceans of shale gas and oil in America in about 2006, the domestic production of oil and gas surged by more than 30% between 2005 and 2012. This completely reversed a 3-decade decline in U.S. oil and gas output. 3 decades of decline reversed by one man who refused to listen to his own engineers. U.S. shale gas production went from 5 billion cubic feet per day in 2007 to 80 billion cubic feet per day in 2023. That is a 16-fold increase in 16 years. That is a compounded annual growth rate of 20.8% per year. If your savings account grew at 20.8% per year, you would retire in about 15 minutes. The United States was transformed from a country that was literally running out of natural gas in 2007 and building liquefied natural gas facilities to import natural gas to becoming the world's largest natural gas producer in 2011 and exporting liquefied natural gas. Read that again. In 2007, America was building import terminals to bring in foreign natural gas because domestic production was so inadequate. By 2011, 4 years later, it was the world's largest producer. The energy landscape shifted that fast. The same hydraulic fracturing technology was also used to extract crude oil, which propelled the U.S. to overtake Saudi Arabia in 2018 to become the world's largest producer of crude oil. Since 2017, the United States has been the largest oil producer in the world. Let me just pause there for 1 second because this is a fact that requires some processing. The country that was humiliated by an oil embargo in 1973, the country that spent 30 years watching its domestic production fall, the country that built its entire post-Cold War foreign policy around protecting access to Middle Eastern oil, that country is now the largest oil producer in the world. And it got there not through government intervention, not through a national energy plan, but because one Greek-American wildcatter from Galveston refused to accept that something was impossible. George Mitchell died in July 2013 at the age of 94 at his home in Galveston. He got to watch the revolution he started reshape the entire global energy market before he died. He passed away at the age of 94 and had the privilege not always awarded to great leaders, that of witnessing how their work remade everything. Now, here is where I want to bring back the subplot I introduced earlier, because the result of Mitchell's shale revolution was not just economic, it was geopolitical in a way that directly answered the question that had haunted American foreign policy since 1973. In 2019, the United States became a net exporter of energy for the first time since 1952, not a net exporter of one type of energy. In terms of all forms of energy, oil, gas, coal, refined products, and so on, the United States exports more than it imports. The surplus energy production helped energy exports grow to a record high 30.9 quadrillion British thermal units in 2024, up 4% from 2023. Energy imports stayed flat at 21.7 quads, meaning the United States exported 9.3 quads more energy than it imported, the highest net exports in records dating back to 1949. The country that could not buy gasoline on Sundays in 1973 is now exporting more energy than any other nation has ever exported in recorded history. That is the story. That is the full arc. But wait, we are not actually at the end yet. Because while the shale revolution was rewriting the fossil fuel story, something else was happening simultaneously that is going to define the next 200 years of American energy history. Renewables. In 2019, U.S. annual energy consumption from renewable sources exceeded coal consumption for the first time since before 1885, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's monthly energy review. Let that sink in. The last time America consumed more renewable energy than coal was before 1885, before the age of electricity, before the automobile, before the telephone was widespread. And then in 2019, the same year America became a net energy exporter, renewables crossed back above coal for the first time in 134 years. This outcome mainly reflects the continued decline in the amount of coal used for electricity generation over the past decade, as well as growth in renewable energy, mostly from wind and solar. In 2025, the United States is doing something historically unprecedented. It is simultaneously the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, and a world leader in renewable energy investment, the biggest fossil fuel exporter, and one of the biggest clean energy investors. These two things are not quite contradictions, reflecting a genuine tension at the heart of American energy policy. Energy consumption in the United States totaled 94.2 quads in 2024, remaining below the peak of 99.0 quads set in 2007, even as the economy is dramatically larger. The country is actually using energy more efficiently than at any point in its history. More economic output per unit of energy consumed. Petroleum remained the largest source of primary energy consumption in the United States in 2024, totaling 35.3 quads. Natural gas consumption reached an all-time high in 2024 at 34.2 quads, driven by growth in natural gas used for electricity generation. Coal consumption fell to 7.9 quads, the least in records dating back to 1949. Coal was at its lowest level in recorded history. Oil is still king. Natural gas is at an all-time high. Renewables are growing at 20 to 25% per year. And the US is producing more total energy than any country has ever produced, all simultaneously. History loves a pattern interrupt. The thing that made the United States energy independent was not the thing everyone was rooting for. The green energy advocates were not the ones who ended decades of foreign oil dependence. It was fracking. It was horizontal drilling. It was a technology that came from a man the industry considered a crank, using techniques borrowed from saltwell drilling developed over 2 decades of failed experiments in the Barnett Shale of North Texas. The thing everyone said was impossible was the thing that actually changed everything. The subplot I introduced, the dream of energy independence, has a resolution that nobody quite expected. The United States is technically an energy net exporter on an all-energy basis since 2019, driven by record oil and gas production and growing renewable output. But claims that the nation is therefore entirely energy independent are overstated. Production gains provide resilience and leverage, not a protective bubble. The global oil market is still just that, global. When a war breaks out in the Middle East, or when OPEC decides to cut production, American gasoline prices still move. American consumers still feel it. True energy independence, the kind where geopolitical shocks in Riyadh or Moscow do not affect prices at your local pump, is still aspirational. But compare that to 1973. Compare the position of the United States today, the world's largest energy producer, a major exporter of liquefied natural gas to Europe and Asia, a country whose shale production is large enough to swing global oil prices, compared to the country that was standing in gas lines and wondering if it could heat its homes. The transformation is so complete that it is genuinely difficult to remember how vulnerable America felt just 50 years ago. Total energy production in the United States increased to a new record of 107 quadrillion British thermal units in 2025, a 3.4% increase from the previous record set in 2024. Total production was driven by record high production in natural gas, crude oil, natural gas plant liquids, and renewables. This was the 4th consecutive year of records in every category. Simultaneously, dry natural gas production grew more than 4% from 2024 to a record high 39 trillion cubic feet in 2025. Renewable energy production grew by 3% from 2024 to a new record, the 5th consecutive year of growth.